My wife said she was going on a romantic date with her boss. I just looked at her, with the calm of someone who had been dead inside for some time, and replied, "Then sleep there. You're not coming back here." She expected something else. She expected a fuss, a scream, a desperate plea to stay. But there was nothing. Only silence and decision. And it was there, in the calm sound of my goodbye, that she finally understood, she had lost everything. From that moment on, our paths parted like broken glass. A love of years, built on routine, small gestures, sacrifices and plans for the future, collapsed with a single sentence. And it wasn't mine. She said she no longer knew what she felt, that perhaps she was confused. That she wanted to experiment. She used words like freedom, curiosity, reconnecting with herself. I listened silently, without moving a muscle. Because deep down, I already understood that nothing she said would change the fact, the betrayal was already done. Because betrayal doesn't start in bed. It starts in the heart. It starts when you look at someone and think, I can have something better. It starts when you have someone by your side, but they're somewhere else. It starts when respect dies and you don't even realize it. I remember the smell of coffee that morning she told me. She came out of the room dressed as if she were going to a special dinner, strong perfume, hair styled, sparkle in her eyes. The same eyes that once shone for me. When she walked through the door, holding her car keys, she hesitated for a second. I think she was still waiting for me to beg, to fight, to say, stay. But I didn't. Because love, when it's true, doesn't beg for someone who's already chosen to leave. Love doesn't survive on crumbs. It doesn't thrive on competition. Love that respects itself knows when to let go. For months, I tried to understand where everything went wrong. There were no fights, no yelling. But there was also no more conversation. I saw her looking at her phone, smiling to herself. I saw her start caring more about her clothes, her body, her appearance. I saw her start coming back later, with over-rehearsed excuses. And yet, I wanted to believe it was just a phase. That the outside world was trying to seduce her, but that our home was still stronger. I wanted to believe. But she didn't want to stay. After she left, the house fell silent. Deadly silence. Her scent still lingered on the pillows, the objects still in place, the souvenirs in every corner. I spent days wondering what it was like to live alone again. I wondered if it had all been a lie. If the years together meant nothing. But the pain answered me. The pain of those who trusted. The pain of those who truly loved. The pain of those who had to say goodbye without being consulted. Without an apology, without regret. As if betrayal were a right, a movement toward freedom, a phase of the soul. The strangest thing is that she never truly apologized. She said things like, I needed to find myself again, maybe one day you'll understand, you're a good man, but, there was always a but. As if the mistake had been mine for not being enough. For not having consciously prevented what she chose. And for a long time, I almost believed it. I almost blamed myself. I almost belittled myself. Until I understood that the choice to cheat is never the fault of the one being cheated on. The choice to cheat is born of selfishness, cowardice, and the inability to face one's own emptiness. Over time, something changed in me. Pain turned into strength. Loneliness turned into healing. And silence turned into peace. I began to rediscover my own life, my own values, my own dreams. Until one day, I met someone. Someone who looked into my eyes as if seeing a soul, not an obligation. Someone who smiled with the calm of someone who didn't need to compete with anyone. Someone who knew the value of love truly delivered. And then I understood, the problem was never me. The problem was her choosing to turn her back on someone who would never have turned theirs for her. Meanwhile, she followed a different path. She had what she wanted, for a while. The enchantment of a new affair. The adrenaline of the forbidden. The vanity of being desired by someone from outside. But she soon discovered that what seems like passion may just be an inflated ego. And what seems like freedom may just be poorly disguised loneliness. Because those who cheat don't know what to do with their guilt when the noise of the world fades. And, little by little, the noise faded. The affair cooled. The boss, who had been so passionate, lost interest. The nights grew longer. The days emptier. And she, more regretful. I'm not sure how long it took for her to try to get back together. She texted. She wanted to talk. She said she saw everything clearly now. That she regretted it. That she missed me. But by then, it was too late. My heart was at peace. I no longer felt anger. Or longing. I just felt nothing. And it was this nothingness that destroyed her. Because the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And when someone realizes they've lost even the right to be hated, that's when the penny really drops. She tried to move on with her life. She pretended she was fine. But deep down, she knew. She knew she'd thrown away the only love that had ever been whole. That she would never be looked at by another man with the eyes I looked at her. That no one would listen to her stories with the same interest. That no one would hug her in the middle of the night just because she'd had a nightmare. That no one would understand her crises the way I did. She knew she'd lost. And not just me. She'd lost the respect of her own conscience. And that, no one can give back. Sometimes they say everything passes. That time heals. But not everything passes. Some choices haunt us. And some losses are forever. She didn't just lose a husband. She lost a home. A future. She lost the better version of herself that existed when she was with me. Today, they say she rarely smiles. That she's distant. That she doesn't trust anyone. But the strangest thing is that, from time to time, they write to me saying she still dreams of me. That she wakes up crying. That she says my name in her sleep. And there remains the question that has never left me alone: how can someone destroy their own home on impulse? How can someone throw away everything on a fleeting whim? Maybe she herself doesn't know the answer. But I know what I said that day. Then sleep there. You're never coming back. And it was with that sentence, so simple, yet so definitive, that my life began to change. I chose to move on. I chose to heal. I chose to live. But did she ever wake up from her own dreams? Because, what if you spent the rest of your life dreaming about the person you pushed away? What if every night became a reminder of what you lost because of a choice that lasted only seconds? What if your punishment wasn't contempt, but the absolute silence of someone who once loved you with everything, and now feels nothing anymore? The answer is in everything that comes after. Welcome to the channel. Here, we neither romanticize nor condone any form of betrayal. All stories presented are works of fiction, created to show, with intensity and realism, how betrayal can destroy feelings, families, and entire lives. Our purpose is clear: to reveal the profound emotional consequences of wrong choices, and to remind people that respect, loyalty, and true love are not interchangeable. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a reminder. It's a reality check. It's the pain of someone who's been betrayed, told as it really is. Good story. His name was Ethan. He had that kind of quiet presence that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. He was the kind of man who seemed to belong more to gestures than words: observant, attentive, constant. He worked in civil engineering, spending his days among calculations, digital drawing boards, and construction projects in progress, but his outlook was more human than technical. There was a sense of responsibility in him that overflowed beyond work. He carried on his shoulders the firmness of someone who doesn't run away, of someone who endures, of someone who understands that love is a daily commitment and not a fleeting emotion. Deep down, he was a simple man. He liked to cook on Sundays, listen to music while cleaning the house, drink coffee looking out the window before the day began. But it was in the way he cared for people, without promises, without fanfare, that he stood out most. Her name was Emily. She had a spontaneous glow, a light laugh that emerged as if she owed the world nothing. She was a literature teacher at a private school, passionate about stories, symbols, and metaphors. She lived amidst books, plants, and melancholic playlists, and had an almost natural talent for transforming routine into poetry. She was vain, yes, but not in an empty way. She cared for herself as if she understood her own worth, as if she knew that beauty is also care, also communication. Emily was full of opinions, but she knew how to listen. She knew how to argue, but she also knew how to yield. She harbored a restlessness that, sometimes, even she couldn't name. And perhaps it was this restlessness that drew her closer to Ethan. When they met at a mutual friend's party, the comfortable silence that brought them closer was the comfortable silence. They didn't need catchphrases or immediate declarations. All it took was a glance exchanged during the wrong song, a whispered joke between glasses of wine, and an unrehearsed dance. They left that night with their numbers exchanged and an unusual feeling. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. As if, before they saw each other, they already knew there was room for each other. The beginning was easy. Movies on Saturdays, long coffees on Sundays, endless conversations about everything, and nothing at all. Emily liked to question everything, Ethan liked to listen. She talked about Clarice Lispector, and he responded with technical comparisons she found amusing. She dreamed of traveling to exotic places, he wanted a house with a garden and a dog. And amidst these differences, they found a balance. They had different dreams, but wanted to achieve them together. Over time, they molded themselves to each other. Not in the sense of losing their individuality, but of learning to coexist with imperfections. Emily had profound existential crises and periods of silence that came out of nowhere. Ethan learned to respect her timing, but also knew when to pull her back into life. On the other hand, he had a tendency toward excessive routine, toward an almost too comfortable predictability, and it was she who reminded him that the unexpected was also important. It was a relationship with pauses, yes, but without absences. There was room for doubt, for boredom, for the emotional distance that sometimes appeared without warning. But above all, there was a silent agreement to permanence. The house where they moved in together was small, but it had soul. A living room with a bookshelf that blended engineering and literature, a kitchen where Ethan prepared elaborate dishes while Emily narrated random childhood stories. The bedroom was divided between his more organized side and her creative chaos. It was there, in that space as imperfect as it was sincere, that they built their life together. And for a long time, that was enough. Friends said they were the kind of couple that seemed tailor-made. The kind of relationship that inspired, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. They had almost silly rituals that became precious over time. Every Friday night, they ordered food from a different restaurant and watched a movie chosen by lottery. On Saturdays, they walked together in the park and discussed philosophical matters with the lightheartedness of someone who loves each other enough to disagree without distancing themselves. There was no major drama. Just a shared life, full of small gestures that, in the end, sustained what they had. But, as with almost everything in life, time began to work its changes. And they didn't come with arguments or harsh words. They came in silence. They came in the form of averted glances, shorter kisses, automatic responses. They came on the days when Emily seemed too distant, immersed in thoughts she no longer shared with Ethan. They came on the nights when he preferred to work late to avoid the emptiness of the living room. They came when they began to live more alongside each other than together. And perhaps because they were so careful with each other, they were slow to face the abyss that was beginning to open between them. Ethan, always rational, attributed everything to fatigue, the pace of adult life, and routine. He believed they were going through a phase. That every long-term relationship had cycles, of enchantment, stagnation, and rebuilding. And that, If they were patient, love would find its place again. Emily, on the other hand, sank into deep silences. She spent more time away, busying herself with new courses, new friendships, new conversations. He said he needed to rediscover himself. And Ethan, respecting her freedom, tried to support her, even without fully understanding. There were still many good times. Short weekend trips, impromptu pancake breakfasts and laughter, books read together. But the frequency of these moments dwindled. And while the love hadn't disappeared entirely, it began to wither. Like a plant slowly losing its light. Ethan understood, but he didn't know how to rescue it. He was a man of practical solutions, but he was dealing with something he couldn't measure or solve logically. Emily, for her part, felt a restlessness she couldn't explain even to herself. There were days when she was moved to see him sleeping beside her, remembering everything they'd built. And there were others when the mere sound of his voice irritated her, as if it represented a prison. He struggled with the guilt of feeling this discomfort, but he couldn't pretend either. And this ambivalence gnawed at her. She had a home, she had a man who loved her. But she missed something she couldn't even name. Their social circle also changed. Emily started hanging out with new people, co-workers, book groups, cultural events. Ethan kept the same friends, the same conversations, the same activities. Not for lack of curiosity, but out of loyalty to his essence. He believed consistency was a value, not a flaw. But to Emily, it sometimes felt like stagnation. They began to live in different emotional time zones. One went to bed earlier, the other woke up later. One wanted conversation, the other silence. And, little by little, the "we" became two eyes that collided. Still, there were attempts. Ethan prepared surprise dinners, wrote notes, proposed trips. Emily smiled, thanked him, but her soul seemed elsewhere. And that hurt more than any argument. Because there was no confrontation, no fighting, no shouting. Just the serene distance that kills slowly. The kind of pain that doesn't show in photos, but screams in the details. To outsiders, they remained the perfect couple. Hardworking, stable, polite, smiling at family events. But anyone who looked closely would see that something had changed. Not in the grand gestures, but in the small pauses. In the touches that no longer happened. In the hugs that had become routine. In the lack of sparkle in their eyes. Their story, up until that point, seemed to have been built on the stuff of great loves, complicity, patience, respect. But even great loves can be lost when communication dries up. When silence becomes habit. When loneliness as a couple becomes crueler than any abandonment. And it was in this scenario, with this cracked foundation and these confused emotions, that life prepared the big curve. A curve that hadn't yet been made, but that was already announced in the subtext of the days. Because even though the love was still there, somehow, perhaps it was no longer enough. And when that happens, when love starts to not be enough, that's when the paths begin to change direction, sometimes irreversibly. Emily began to change almost imperceptibly. The details were small at first, so subtle they seemed part of the natural phases of living together. She swapped her usual perfume for a new, more intense scent and began spending more time in front of the mirror in the morning, choosing outfits that seemed carefully thought out, even on ordinary workdays. She began going out later, citing last-minute appointments, impromptu meetings, school events, or educational dinners. Ethan, accustomed to routine, fixed schedules, and the predictability of home, noticed the deviations but absorbed them like someone who prefers trust to distrust. Deep down, he carried the silent hope that this phase would pass, like so many others they had faced together. But there was a dull uneasiness, a kind of uneasiness that took shape more and more clearly in his chest, a feeling that grew in the darkness, even when he tried not to name it. Sundays, once sacred, became lonely days. Emily said she was tired, wanted to sleep in, and asked for silence when she woke up. Ethan, unsure of how to position himself, began making breakfast alone, walking in the park alone, watching movies with his phone in hand, feigning distraction so as not to face her absence beside him on the couch. It wasn't just her physical presence that was missing. It was her energy, her sparkle, her emotional involvement. Emily was there, but she was no longer with him. And this disguised absence was what hurt the most. He tried to reconnect with small gestures, leaving flowers on her desk, writing short notes with phrases that had once made her smile, suggesting trips, weekends away, dinners, but her response was lukewarm, with polite excuses, automatic smiles, and averted eyes. In conversations, she talked about new ideas, school projects, co-workers who now seemed fascinating. She mentioned names Ethan didn't know with a familiarity that bothered him, though he tried not to show it. One of these names came up frequently, the new pedagogical coordinator, someone praised for his modern ideas, charisma, and humanistic vision. Emily spoke about him with too much enthusiasm, in too much detail. And the more she mentioned that name, the less she talked about herself. Or about Ethan. And that was the strangest thing, she no longer saw herself as part of the relationship. She spoke as an outsider, as an observer of her own married life, as if she belonged to another narrative, more vivid, more intense, more her own. One night, when she got home, Emily was on the phone. Her voice was low, intimate, and when she noticed her husband's presence, she quickly hung up, feigning distraction. She said she was a friend, that they were working on a school presentation. Ethan didn't question it. Not because I believed her, but because he was tired of seeming insecure. He still clung to the idea that trust was a virtue, even though his instincts screamed otherwise. But that night, as he washed the dishes, her words echoed in his head. Her intonation wasn't the same as she'd used with a friend. There was a forced sweetness there, a carefully camouflaged intimacy. He said nothing, but he felt, for the first time clearly, that something had broken. The following days were even colder. Emily became increasingly inaccessible. She avoided physical contact, avoided questions. When he tried to strike up a conversation, she responded with monosyllables. The atmosphere was one of pent-up tension, as if one misstep could trigger a meltdown. Until, one Saturday morning, while they were silently drinking coffee, she left her phone on the table and went to the bathroom. It vibrated with a message. Ethan had never been one to snoop. He'd always believed that invading the privacy of someone you love was a kind of betrayal, too. But something about that morning felt different. The phone was unlocked. The screen lit up. The notification appeared clearly, "I'm counting down the hours until our dinner tonight. You looked beautiful yesterday. I can't stop thinking about you." And then, the sender's signature. The name she'd been mentioning over and over for the past few weeks. Ethan didn't feel anger. Not then. What came first was an internal silence, as if his entire body had shut down. As if everything stopped. And then, as if by reflex, he simply left his phone where it was. When Emily returned, he watched her closely but said nothing. And she didn't notice anything either. The day went on as normal. But something had already changed inside him. It was no longer doubt. It was certainty. And this certainty, unlike suspicion, didn't allow for hope. For that entire week, he didn't bring up the subject. He continued to live by her side, observing her movements, her excuses, her nightly outings with flimsy justifications. It wasn't surveillance. It was a silent farewell. It was his heart preparing for the end. He needed to understand the depth of the wound before deciding what to do with it. He needed to hear it with his own ears. He needed to see her confess, because part of him still tried to believe there might be some explanation, even if it was a comforting lie. Just one more. Just one more before the fall. On Thursday, she arrived home later than usual. She wore a displaced smile on her face, as if she were somewhere else. Ethan was sitting on the couch, the TV on mute. She walked in and hesitated for a few seconds. As if she'd forgotten she lived there. As if the house wasn't hers anymore. He called her over to talk. He asked her to sit down. She took a while to respond, but she approached. There was something in his gaze that disconcerted her. A kind of calm that clashed with the tension in the room. And then he asked, bluntly, if she was with someone else. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes darted for escape. She tried to smile, tried to look away, tried to deny it. But she couldn't. Because his voice was firm, there was no room for manipulation. She remained silent for long seconds. Until, with a whisper of a voice, she admitted it. She said she had met someone. That it wasn't planned. That everything had happened too quickly. That she was confused. That she didn't know how to say it. That she didn't want to hurt. The words came in a sequence, as if she were trying to control the damage. But there was nothing left to control. It was already done. Ethan listened to everything in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. And that disconcerted her more than any other scene. Because she expected a different reaction. She expected pain, desperation, a plea to stay. But he just stood, walked to the door, and said in the calmest voice she'd ever heard, "Then sleep there. You're not coming back here." She stared at him in shock. As if she didn't recognize the man. As if his rejection hurt her more than her own guilt. She stood there, waiting for him to back off. But he didn't. Emily left that night without another word. And the door closed behind her with a final sound. Ethan stood in the room, breathing deeply. There was no relief, no pain. There was only a strange peace. The peace of knowing they tried until the end. And that, now, they didn't need to try anymore. What he didn't yet know, was that this was just the beginning. Because there was something Emily had never told him. Something that would transform not only the end of their marriage, but also the years that came before. A secret she'd kept so carefully that she hadn't even dared to mention it in moments of guilt. And now, more than ever, it was about to come to light. 2 weeks had passed since the door closed, since Ethan's calm voice sealed the end of a cycle. Emily hadn't returned. She hadn't called for the first few days. She hadn't texted. As if she were trying to give him space, or perhaps just waiting for him to weaken. For him to surrender to some lingering longing. But that didn't happen. On the other side, Ethan wouldn't allow himself to look back. He continued his days automatically, a silent routine punctuated by long pauses in front of the mirror, where he no longer saw the same man. Not for lack of self-love, but for an excess of lucidity. He knew he had tried. He knew he had been whole. And for that, he owed no one anything more. But her absence, however unwanted, reverberated in details. The emptiness of the bed, the scent of perfume that still lingered on the sheets, the mug she used for breakfast that he avoided touching. Everything was steeped in a past that now hurt, not because of its loss, but because of the way it was ripped away. When Emily finally approached him, her voice was low, almost shy, as if doubting her own right to be there. "You said you needed to talk. That you had something to say." Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to reopen wounds. He saw no point in listening to belated excuses. But there was something in her tone that made him relent. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of final respect for everything they'd been through. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, somewhere no one knew them. She arrived first, sitting by the window, her empty eyes staring outside as if waiting for some invisible answer. When she saw him enter, she looked up quickly and smiled, a fragile smile that didn't reach the corners of her mouth. He sat in silence. There was nothing to say. Emily seemed to understand this. She stirred the cup in front of her, took a few deep breaths, and tried to find words that wouldn't come. Until, after several long minutes, she said she needed to tell him something she'd never had the courage to say. Something that, she thought, deserved to be said before they both went their separate ways. Ethan remained silent, just staring at her steadily. She began slowly, explaining that the romance with the other man was over, but that wasn't what she was here to discuss. She said the biggest mistake wasn't getting involved with someone outside of her marriage, but something that happened long before. Something she'd buried so deeply she'd started to pretend to herself it never existed. The air seemed thicker. The voices around her faded. Emily said that 2 years earlier, she had a brief existential crisis. She felt lost, unsure if she was living the life she wanted. She said Ethan had always been present, affectionate, a true companion. But precisely because of that, she felt he was too good for her at a time when she felt smaller than her own shadow. On a work trip to another city, she met someone. A quick fling, with no strings attached, no promises. She believed it was just an isolated mistake, the result of the confusion she carried. When she returned, she carried the weight of what she had done and tried to suffocate it under her routine. She never told him anything, thinking that, with time, the guilt would disappear. But it didn't. And the worst, according to her, was yet to come. Ethan remained silent, but his eyes were no longer the same. They were teary, but steady. He was breathing heavily, like someone facing an internal earthquake and needing to maintain control. Emily paused for a long time. He said that brief affair had left a mark she never revealed. A secret she kept to herself, silently, afraid that by confessing, she would lose everything. She said that after the trip, when she discovered she was pregnant, she was never sure who the father was. That she did the math, that she tried to convince herself it was Ethan's because she desperately needed it. Because if it were his, everything could still work out. But I always knew, deep down, that there was a real chance it wasn't. And that I never said anything. That I allowed him to embrace the pregnancy with enthusiasm, to paint the walls of the room, to buy toys, to cry with emotion during the ultrasounds. And that when the baby didn't survive the birth, she cried beside him as if the pain were the same, but different. Because she was crying not just over the death of a child, but over the death of a secret she thought would never come to light. Ethan lowered his eyes. His fingers trembled. His heart crushed. He remembered the day he'd held her hand in the maternity ward, trying to appear strong, telling her they'd get through this together. He remembered the nights he'd cried in the bathroom so as not to worry her, the times he'd stayed up reading about grief, about pregnancy loss, about how to support a partner. All of that now took on a meaning he'd never imagined. And there, faced with that revelation, the world seemed to crumble in slow motion. Emily said she wasn't there for forgiveness. That she knew nothing justified it. But that she needed to free them both from that silent lie that shaped much of their lives. Ethan, still silent, slowly stood up. He grabbed his wallet, paid the bill, looked at her one last time, and simply said that he understood everything now. That her silence now made sense. That the emptiness in the house now had a name. Emily tried to call out to him, tried to explain that, despite everything, their love was real. That regret was legitimate. That she spent nights dreaming of what they had, and days wishing they could take it back. She said he appeared in her dreams, always smiling, always telling her he loved her. That, in the early hours of the morning, she woke up crying because she realized he was no longer there. But Ethan was already at the door. And, for the first time, she didn't look back. Because, in that exit, there was something no other had ever known, relief. Outside, the world went on. People laughed at the surrounding tables, waiters hurried past, the afternoon sun beat down on the sidewalks. But inside Ethan, everything was silent. It was the silence of someone who had lost so much, but also of someone who had just freed themselves from a weight they never asked to carry. Emily stood there, teary-eyed, staring at the empty cafe. Her phone in her hands, the messages from the past open. And a cruel certainty in her chest, she would never again know the kind of love she had destroyed. Because not all mistakes are reversible. And some secrets, once revealed, don't just erase trust. They erase the entire story. Ethan left that cafe with a firm step, but inside, every inch of him carried the weight of a decade crumbling. He walked aimlessly through the narrow streets of downtown, ignoring the cars, the shop windows, the sounds, the faces. The world had become a blurred, irrelevant backdrop. Emily's words still echoed brutally within him, as if they had been etched in fire. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about being thrust into a role that was never his. Having experienced a pain that wasn't his, as he'd imagined, having buried a child who might not even have been his. A grief he carried as a father, as a husband, as a man who believed in every gesture, every promise. And now, all of that was disintegrating, as if the truth had dissolved the glue of every piece of his story. She walked to a secluded park, one of those where she used to walk with Emily on Saturday mornings, before everything began to unravel. She sat on a secluded bench beneath a huge tree that cast too much shade for the time of day. There, finally, she allowed the tears to come, silent, heavy, a cry that was no longer of sadness, nor anger, nor bewilderment. It was a cry of emptiness, of an end. Ethan wept as if saying goodbye to an entire future. As if understanding that nothing, absolutely nothing, of what had been lived could ever be reconstructed in the same way. He wept too for that son whom, however distant it now seemed, he had loved from the first heartbeat on the ultrasound. He loved with the purity of someone who didn't know. And now, even with the doubt, that love was still there, wounded, distorted, but real. The following days were dry. Ethan withdrew from everything. From work, from friends, from routine. He needed to rebuild not his life, but his vision of what he'd experienced. He spent nights awake recalling conversations, scenes, Emily's reactions during the pregnancy, during her grief. Everything began to take on new meaning, as if his memory had been invaded by a new lens. Her smile, back then, now seemed forced. Her words of comfort, automatic. Her hugs, empty. And even trying to find a moment of indisputable truth, he could only find questions. It was as if his entire history were being re-edited without his permission. Emily tried to contact him again. He sent a handwritten letter, its pages awkwardly folded, as if they had been rewritten many times before being placed in the envelope. Ethan didn't open it. He tucked the letter away in a drawer and decided that if he were ever ready to read it, he would know. For now, he didn't want any more words. He wanted air. He wanted time. He wanted to get away from the constant echo of the lies. Because the hardest thing about all that revelation wasn't what she'd told him, but what it meant about her. About the kind of person she'd chosen to be when she had the chance to be honest. She'd let him believe a story that wasn't his. And that, in itself, can't be fixed by belated regret. One morning, weeks later, he decided to travel. He got in his car with no specific destination, took a few clothes, and turned off his cell phone. He wanted to lose himself along the way, disconnect from the faces, the memories, the scenes marked by the we. He arrived in a small coastal town where no one knew his name and stayed in a simple inn facing the sea. The days there passed slowly. He woke early, walked barefoot in the sand, read old books forgotten at the reception, ate in silence in restaurants where no one recognized him. And in this slow, almost contemplative pace, he began to feel his heart deflate. Not from pain, but from pressure. As if he were relearning to breathe. It wasn't happiness yet. It was just lightness. It was on one of these days that he met Claire. A woman with clear eyes, a restrained smile, and calm gestures. She worked at the inn, helping with breakfast, organizing the rooms, and tending the plants. She wasn't exactly as pretty as Emily, but there was a quiet beauty about her, born from the way she treated the things around her. She seemed at peace with the world and with herself, which caused Ethan a sense of strangeness and, at the same time, relief. At first, they talked about nothing, the weather, restaurant hours, the best spots to watch the sunset. But as the days passed, their conversations grew deeper, unhurried, unpressured, and unpressured. She never asked directly about his personal life, but there was understanding in her eyes, as if she knew there was a soul trying to find its feet. One night, over wine on a wooden deck, Claire spoke of her losses. She said she had loved and been left, that she had scars that no longer hurt, but that taught her the way back to herself. Ethan listened in silence. And for the first time, he felt the urge to tell his story. Not all of it. Not in detail. But enough to let her know he was there, starting from scratch, not because he chose to, but because he needed to. Claire didn't react with shock or pity. She simply held his hand for a few seconds and said that sometimes, what life breaks, it puts back together with greater strength. This stayed with him for days. It wasn't comfort. It was true. Meanwhile, Emily sank into silence. She continued with the same job, the same colleagues, but life no longer held the same spark. The nights were long, and dreams of Ethan became recurrent. She dreamed of him laughing, dreamed of the home they'd shared, of the smell of the kitchen on Sundays, of the sound of his laughter as he told her stories she already knew. But she always woke up with a wet pillow. There was no regret enough to erase what had been done. She tried to rebuild herself through therapy, courses, new friendships, but there was a void that no amount of work could fill. And the worst part wasn't knowing she'd lost Ethan. It was knowing he'd moved on. That she was no longer part of any good memories of him. And that, now, he was making memories with someone else. One weekend, Emily decided to go to the town where she'd heard Ethan was staying. She didn't want to regain anything, she told herself. She just needed to see. She needed to know if there was still any chance of connection, of some recognition, of a look that said, "I still remember us." She arrived and saw him from afar, sitting in an outdoor cafe, laughing with Claire. Really laughing. Laughing freely. That scene hit her like a sharp blow. There was no room for her there. There was no more room, no more hesitation. For the first time, she saw Ethan at ease. And she finally understood how much he'd suffered beside her without showing it. Back home, Emily began to live as if carrying a weight that would never be lifted. There was no greater pain than knowing she had become a ghost in the life of someone who once loved her so much. And the real punishment didn't come from loneliness or guilt. It came from dreams. Every night, she still dreams of Ethan. She dreams of a life she will no longer have. She dreams of a home that no longer exists. She dreams of a peace she herself destroyed. She dreams of a man who now belongs to another story. And she wakes up, always, in the same place, alone. Shrouded in a silence that no longer consoles. Because now, she doesn't just have to deal with the loss. She needs to learn to live with the fact that he doesn't hate her, doesn't feel anger, doesn't feel pain. The worst punishment of all, is knowing he no longer feels anything. The sun was beginning to set with a serene slowness as Ethan walked back to the inn after another peaceful afternoon with Claire. His steps were light, the air felt different, cleaner, as if he had finally shed an old weight he'd carried around for years without realizing it. It wasn't euphoria, nor a fresh start in the romantic, idealized sense, but a new way of existing, more sincere, more his own. Claire's company didn't invasively occupy spaces, she didn't try to fill voids or pose as a solution. She was simply present, light, gentle, constant. And in that presence, Ethan felt seen in a new way, without demands, without tainted memories. For the first time, he didn't need to prove himself good enough. He didn't need to wonder what he was doing wrong. Claire demanded nothing. She simply stayed. And that was enough. But there was still a quiet corner within him, a place he didn't often visit, where memories of Emily endured with dignity and pain. It was impossible to deny that part of his history was intertwined with that woman. And no matter how many times he turned the page, the traces were still there, etched in the skin of time, in the subtlest details of her habits. The way she folded her clothes, the way she drank her coffee, the way she noticed the small changes in the weather, all of it carried some influence from the years they'd shared. And although there was no longer any desire, no longing in the romantic sense, there was a deep wound, now healed, but which occasionally itched, a reminder that not all pain disappears. Some simply subside so that life can go on. Emily, for her part, seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. Increasingly immersed in her own absence, she began frequenting different places, reaching out to new people, seeking distractions that lasted no more than a few hours. She tried to experience new versions of herself, hoping to rediscover some intact part that still made sense. But the truth was, she no longer recognized herself. She had lost not only Ethan's love, but the woman she was when she was with him. And this realization slowly consumed her. The nights were long, filled with silences that weighed more heavily than any noise. The memories came with force, but not as solace. They came as a mirror of all that had been wasted. And it was this awareness, the knowledge of what she had had and chose not to value, that tortured her the most. The moral dilemma that now surrounded her was no longer the immediate remorse of betrayal. It was deeper. Emily found herself needing to understand why she did what she did, why she lied, why she let Ethan believe a story she herself knew was fragile. The issue was no longer seeking his forgiveness, she knew that was beyond reach, but forgiving herself, which proved an even greater challenge. And in the process, she realized that living with guilt is easy for those who still believe they can fix things. What's truly difficult is when you understand there's nothing left to fix, and that forgiveness, even when possible, doesn't restore what was broken. Some losses are permanent, not because there was a lack of love, but because there was a lack of respect at the moment when it was most needed. She wrote letters she never sent, recorded audio recordings she always deleted before finishing. She tried to confess everything to her therapist, but there was a part of the pain that even professionals couldn't reach. It was a void that couldn't be filled with explanations, because the lack wasn't of understanding, it was of presence. Ethan had left in a way she hadn't expected. Not physically, she knew he wouldn't return, but emotionally. There wasn't even any resentment left in him. And that was the true punishment. Because when someone hates you, they still see you. But when you no longer feel anything, it's as if you cease to exist. And Emily now knew what that was like. She knew what it was like to be invisible to the person who loved her most. Meanwhile, Claire also felt the weight of being involved with someone rebuilding. She saw in Ethan a sad beauty, a strength that came from pain rather than stability. She knew he wasn't a completely available man, that part of him still belonged to what had come before. But she didn't demand it. She accepted it with maturity, with the respect of someone who also knew the layers of loss. One night, sitting by the sea, she looked at him with rare honesty and told him she didn't need him to love her now. She said she knew that love doesn't spring from a newly cleansed void, but from a land that needs tending before it can bloom again. Ethan didn't respond with words, but held her hand firmly. And in that gesture, there was more truth than in any rehearsed statement. The dilemma now emerging within Ethan was different. It wasn't about Emily anymore. She no longer occupied any space in the present. But rather about something more internal, how to rebuild one's identity after being shattered from within. How to trust one's intuition, one's feelings, again, when everything he had experienced before had been dismantled by an unexpected revelation. How to allow himself to be happy again without the fear of being deceived, manipulated, or overly idealized. These questions had no simple answers. And he knew that any attempt to rush the process would be disrespectful to himself. He needed to take it slowly, step by step, without trying to appear whole while he was still putting the pieces back together. One day, he received a new letter from Emily. This time, he didn't throw it away. He left it on the porch table and stared at it for hours. When he finally decided to open it, he found words less chaotic, less desperate. Emily didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg for anything in return. It was a sober, sad letter, where she simply said thank you. She thanked him for the love she received, for the home they built, for the good memories she knew would never be erased, even if they were now shattered. She said she understood, as clearly as possible, why he left. And that she hoped for nothing more than peace for him. She signed off by saying that, even though it hurt, she was trying to become a better person because of him. Ethan read the letter with a calm heart. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just read. And when he finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it inside a book he was reading, not as if preserving something precious, but as if knowing that that story, however painful, is also part of who he is. It was a healed wound, a story closed. And there was nothing more to say. In the days that followed, his conversations with Claire became deeper. They spoke of a future without promises, of a past without weight. They shared silences as if they understood that time also speaks. And Ethan began, little by little, to allow himself to feel again. Not with the same enthusiasm as someone in love for the first time, but with the maturity of someone who has learned that love is not made of expectations, but of presence. Not of promises, but of constancy. Not of perfection, but of respect. And so, without fanfare, life resumed its course. With scars, with memories, with lessons learned. But also with new perspectives, new connections, and a clarity he'd never had before, that sometimes, the greatest form of love you can offer someone is to let them go. And the greatest form of love you can offer yourself is to never go back. Because starting over isn't about erasing what was experienced, but accepting that certain pages have already been written and that, from them, a new story can be born. Not over, but alongside. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation. That morning, the tide had receded more than usual, and the sandbar seemed wider, more open, as if the ocean itself were giving way for something new to begin. Ethan walked slowly, barefoot, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his thoughts wandering in opposite directions. It had been weeks since Emily's last letter, and even though he had decided not to respond, something inside him still pulsed with a kind of melancholy that no longer stemmed from grief, but from a deep acceptance. It was as if he had finally reached a balance between remembering and moving on. He didn't hate her. He didn't love her. He didn't want to erase the past, nor rewrite it. He simply wanted it to stay where it belonged, in the past. And this understanding brought him a kind of serenity he never imagined he could achieve. Claire accompanied him that morning, in silence. They walked side by side, sometimes with their fingers intertwined, sometimes simply sharing a presence, no words needed. With her, everything was different. There was a delicacy in her manner, a sensitivity that required neither confessions nor guarantees. She didn't demand space, she occupied the space given to her. And Ethan, who for years had lived trapped in trying to understand what was missing in his old relationship, now realized the value of what simply fit effortlessly. Claire never competed with his past. She accepted it, acknowledged it, but walked firmly in the present. And this, for Ethan, was new, liberating, and righteous. That afternoon, they decided to leave the coastal town for a few days and visit a more remote village known for its trails and hidden waterfalls. The road was long, surrounded by dense forests and ancient bridges that seemed to lead not just to a new place, but to a new time. They stayed in a rustic cabin, surrounded by trees and the sounds of birds, where cell phone reception was weak and time seemed to slow down. On their first night there, they sat before a makeshift fireplace, and Ethan, with a distant look in his eyes, said for the first time something Claire hadn't expected to hear. He spoke of forgiveness. Not as an act of kindness to Emily, but as a personal liberation. He said that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, nor justifying, but about letting go of what no longer defined you. Claire simply nodded. She knew those words weren't meant for her. They were for himself. And she respected the silence that followed, as if she knew there were processes that can only be experienced internally. The next morning, as they prepared coffee with the cabin's simple utensils, Claire turned and, in a firm voice, announced that she was falling in love. Ethan stared at her for a moment without saying anything. Then he leaned closer, cupped her face in both hands, and said he was still learning to love again, that he couldn't promise the same pace, but that he was there, whole, willing. Claire smiled. He told her that was more than enough. And in that moment, without formal declarations, without grandiose promises, a new love began to blossom, not like a hurricane, but like a steady breeze, the kind that doesn't frighten, but sustains. Meanwhile, Emily's life grew increasingly silent. She continued her routine, but everything seemed automatic. Friends noticed her distance, her parents no longer insisted on asking questions, and work was her only refuge. Sometimes, during class, she would stop mid-sentence and lose herself in the gaze of a distracted student, as if seeing a younger version of herself. There were moments when she wished she could go back in time, not to change what happened, but to understand who she was before she lost herself. One such night, alone on the balcony of the small apartment she'd moved into, she leafed through an old diary where she'd recorded moments of her relationship with Ethan. Simple phrases, everyday details, things that at the time seemed insignificant but now took on an almost sacred value. She wept silently. Not out of immediate regret, but out of the pain of having experienced something so pure without knowing how to care for it. In an attempt to rebuild herself, she became involved in social projects, volunteered, and dedicated herself to writing short stories about forgiveness, loss, and rebuilding. Little by little, she channeled her guilt into something that could at least leave a mark on the world. She knew she couldn't be remembered only as the woman she betrayed, lied to, and destroyed something good. She needed, somehow, to become something more. Even if that didn't erase what she'd done, she wanted the future to at least justify her efforts to be better. And this movement, though painful, began to restore some sense of purpose. Months later, by coincidence or fate, Emily and Ethan met again. It was in a big city bookstore, both looking for something they didn't even know what it was. When they saw each other, they froze for a moment. Time seemed to stand still, but not because of pain. It stood still because of recognition. There were two people there who knew each other deeply, but who were now strangers to each other. Ethan was the first to smile. A warm, respectful smile, without hurt, without desire. Just a gesture of someone at peace. Emily returned it with an emotional look. He asked how she was doing. She said she was trying to find a new path. He said he hoped she could. She said she knew he already had. And in that brief, restrained, but deeply honest exchange, something was finally closed. When they said goodbye, there were no promises to stay in touch, no attempts to reconnect. Just a mutual nod of recognition, two paths that had crossed, hurt, and were now heading in different directions. Ethan left the bookstore feeling like he had finally gotten over it. Not because he'd forgotten, but because it no longer hurt. And Emily, in turn, walked the streets feeling a strange kind of relief and sadness. She knew she would never see him again, and maybe that was right. Some stories must end so others can begin. But still, somewhere inside her, the memory of that love would accompany her forever. Later that evening, Claire and Ethan walked through a night market in the neighboring town, amid yellow lights, the sounds of laughter, and the smell of fresh food. She asked him how his day had been, and he, without elaborating, replied that he had run into someone from his past. Claire didn't press. She simply held his hand and said, "You're here now. That's what matters." Ethan looked at her tenderly and said, almost in a whisper, that for the first time in years, he felt completely present. Not as an escape, not as solace. But as a choice. A choice born not of blind passion, but of the lucidity of someone who has known pain and now understands the value of lightness. Deep down, they both knew there was still much to build. Pain doesn't disappear overnight, traumas don't evaporate, memories don't fade. But they also knew that true love isn't one that demands immediate healing, but one that offers space for healing to happen. And in that space, in that new life that was forming away from the hurt, Ethan finally found something he'd never had with Emily: peace without doubt, love without fear, and reciprocity without effort. Life, at last, was organizing itself to tell a new story, and this time, with characters ready to live it all truthfully. Time, with its silent way of unhurriedly healing, moved months ahead of the last time those three paths had somehow crossed. Ethan now led a life filled with simplicity and meaning. It wasn't a cinematic existence, there were no luxuries or grand achievements to recount, but there was serenity, and that was the greatest of achievements. He continued living in a smaller town, far from his old home, with a routine he had designed himself. He woke early, tended the plants in the backyard, wrote down loose thoughts in notebooks he always kept nearby, and maintained a small studio where he created architectural models as a hobby. By his side, Claire, with her constant and calm presence, built this home not with promises, but with actions that sustained their love day after day. Neither of them sought perfection or illusions of eternity, but there was truth in every shared choice. And between them, something new was born, a daughter. Small, curious, with his eyes and her lightness. The arrival of this child did not come to complete what was missing, because nothing was missing, but to expand what was already overflowing between the two. Ethan looked at his daughter with a feeling that mixed astonishment and gratitude. Astonishment for having once believed that perhaps love was lost forever. Gratitude for having persisted, for not having closed himself off to the new, even after being shattered into so many pieces. He knew he wasn't the same man he'd been before. Something in him had changed irreversibly. The pain of the past had left its mark, but not bitterness. He had learned to accept that some wounds don't heal completely, they just stop bleeding. And perhaps it was precisely this awareness that made him even more human, more attentive, more profound. He no longer sought explanations for everything. Nor culprits. Nor redemption. He simply wanted to live with the clarity of someone who has learned from loss. Meanwhile, Emily was immersed in another reality, harsher, more introspective. She remained alone, living in a small apartment and maintaining a predictable routine between work and solitude. She never again attempted new, deep relationships. She went out occasionally, talked to strangers, tried to maintain some semblance of social normalcy, but nothing truly connected. There was a weariness in her eyes, as if each new attempt carried with it the weight of something she herself had destroyed. She had recurring nightmares, not of the betrayal, but of the good days, the simple gestures, the looks full of affection that would never return. These dreams, sweet and piercing at the same time, were her true punishment. Because when she woke, reality imposed itself mercilessly. She had been loved sincerely and had chosen to turn her back on it. In the hallways of the school where she taught, she maintained a firm, polite, yet distant demeanor. Her classmates respected her space, few approached her more than necessary. Occasionally, a more sensitive student would be captivated by her words in class and ask if she had ever been truly happy. On those occasions, Emily would simply smile and respond that she had loved more than she could explain. At night, she wrote unsent letters, no longer to Ethan, but to herself. She tried to put into words the void she still felt, what she had lost, what she had become, what she would never be again. And in these letters, her pain became a mirror. She no longer asked anyone for forgiveness. Now, she only asked for peace. But even that didn't come easily. One day, by irony or coincidence, Emily was invited to speak at an education event in a neighboring city. At the end of the program, as she walked between booths and aisles, she heard a familiar voice coming from an open room. It was Ethan, participating as a special guest to speak about sustainable architecture in schools. She saw him from afar, standing next to Claire and the small daughter in his arms. They were smiling. The little girl played with her father's fingers, while Claire chatted with an event organizer. Emily didn't approach. She stood still for a few minutes, observing the scene like someone watching a movie whose ending is already known. And there, in the middle of the crowd, she understood something with brutal clarity: he was happy. Truly happy. And she was no longer part of it. Not as a memory, not as a shadow, not as a possibility. She just wasn't. That night, back at her hotel, Emily stared out the window for hours. She thought about everything she'd experienced, what she'd been through, what she'd pretended not to see, her rash choices. For the first time, she didn't cry. She just felt. She felt the silence differently. Not as emptiness, but as a consequence. She understood that love, when mistreated, doesn't scream. It leaves silently. And that certain losses aren't punishments, they're answers. Answers that life gives to those who confuse freedom with selfishness, desire with disrespect, impulse with destiny. It was the end of an internal cycle. And although she knew the road ahead would still be long, in that moment, she began to accept that she would never have that back, not because the love ended, but because she didn't know how to care for it when she had it. Ethan, for his part, ended the day by putting his daughter to bed. She asked him to tell her a story, and he quietly made up one about a star that got lost in the sky and had to learn to shine alone before finding its constellation again. Claire watched from the doorway, smiling. When he finished, he went to her, hugged her tenderly, and simply told her that he felt at home. And she replied that their home wasn't where they lived, but what they had built together. And so, while their daughter slept in the next room, the two sat on the porch, drinking tea, looking at the sky that now seemed clearer, more stable. Ethan no longer thought about everything he had lost. He thought only of what he had found. And that was the true outcome of his story, not the pain he suffered, but the choice not to let it define who he would be from then on. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? What part touched you most? Comment below, I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories that open eyes and touch hearts. This story is a stark and necessary reminder: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it erodes trust, tears hearts apart, and slowly destroys everything built with love and dedication. No one cheats by accident. It's always a choice. And every choice comes with a price. Sometimes, that price is losing the only true love you'll ever have. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. We tell these stories to show that fidelity, respect, and truth are the pillars of any lasting relationship. May this be clear in every ending, in every tear, in every new beginning. Until the next story.